The doorbell rang at 11:40 at night, and I already knew it wasn't good news, because good news doesn't come with suitcases. My son Daniel stood on the porch with his wife Chelsea beside him. Chelsea, who has a way of smiling at you like she's doing you a favor just by showing up. 2 rolling suitcases. A duffel bag. Chelsea's makeup case balanced on top like she'd packed for a vacation, not an ambush. Daniel wouldn't quite meet my eyes. "We're staying here now," Chelsea said, before I'd even gotten the door all the way open. Not a question. Not can we. Just a fact she'd apparently decided for both of us. I stood there in my robe, blinking at them under the porch light, and some small cold part of me, the part that raised this boy for 31 years, started keeping score before my mouth caught up. Call it an old habit. Call it a ledger I never asked to start but have kept anyway, line after line, for longer than I want to admit. Daniel mumbled something about the lease falling through. Chelsea said something about just until we get back on our feet. I let them in, because that's what you do, because he's my son, and because I am, apparently, the kind of woman people assume will simply absorb whatever gets handed to her. I found out how right I was to notice the pattern about 90 seconds later. Chelsea set her makeup case down on my kitchen counter, pulled a folded sheet of paper from her purse like she'd prepared it in the car, and slid it toward me across the table. A chore list. My chore list. In my house. Meals ready by 6 a.m. Laundry ironed daily. Hers and Daniel's, itemized separately, like I might get confused about whose shirts were whose. Grocery runs twice a week. A note at the bottom, underlined twice. Please keep noise down after 9. We need our rest. I looked at that piece of paper for a long moment. I looked at my son, who suddenly found the floor tiles fascinating. And I smiled. I want to be honest about that smile, because it wasn't warmth. It wasn't even patience. It was the specific, quiet smile of a woman doing arithmetic in her head. To understand how a decent, if imperfect, family arrived at a chore list at midnight, you have to understand what everyone in it had already decided about me long before that doorbell rang. For years, I'd been mom in the sense of a service, not a person. When Daniel was in college, I was the one who wired money the week before finals, no questions, because that's what you do. When he married Chelsea, I paid for the flowers because her parents said the budget was tight this year, and nobody in that family ever mentioned tight again after the wedding. Not when they bought a new car, not when they took a trip to Cancun 8 months later. I noticed. I always noticed. I just didn't say anything, because saying something felt smaller than the relationship, and I was terrified of being smaller than the relationship. Chelsea had a particular gift, I'll call it a gift, though it never felt like one, for narrating me back to myself in the least flattering possible light. To her friends, I was so old-fashioned. To Daniel's cousins, I was sweet, but a little stuck in her ways. Once, at a Thanksgiving I hosted, cooked for, and paid for, I overheard her tell his aunt that I needed something to do now that I'm retired. It keeps her feeling useful. Useful. Like a tool you keep in a drawer. Daniel never corrected any of it. That was its own kind of quiet erosion. Not cruelty, just cowardice dressed up as keeping the peace. He'd laugh along, or change the subject, or shoot me an apologetic look across the room that was supposed to make up for saying nothing. It never did. An apologetic look doesn't cost you anything. Neither does silence. That's exactly why he could afford so much of it. What none of them knew, what I'd never once brought up, because it never seemed like my place to remind people of things they should already know, was that the house they now considered fair game for suitcases and midnight chore lists was mine, not ours. Not some vague family asset everyone assumed would eventually trickle down to Daniel. Mine, outright, paid off 19 years ago, deed in my name only, a fact I'd handled quietly with a lawyer named Priya Anand after my husband passed, specifically so that no one, not Daniel, not some future daughter-in-law, not anyone, could ever assume ownership of my own front door. I also hadn't mentioned, because again, it never seemed relevant, that for the past 2 years I'd been quietly covering the difference on Daniel and Chelsea's rent. Not the whole thing. Just enough that they never noticed how close to the edge they actually were. Wired the same week every month to an account Daniel thought was some kind of family gift from a relative he barely questioned. I did it because I loved him, and because watching your child struggle does something to a mother that logic can't touch. I did the math that night, standing in my kitchen at midnight with a chore list in my hand. 19 years of ownership on one side of the ledger. A folded piece of paper telling me when my laundry needed ironing on the other. They didn't balance. They were never going to balance. And for the first time in longer than I could say, I let myself actually notice that. I told them to get some sleep, that we'd sort things out in the morning. Chelsea looked pleased with herself, like she'd won something. Daniel looked relieved, the way children look when they think a hard conversation has been avoided rather than merely postponed. I didn't sleep much. I sat at the kitchen table with the chore list in front of me and a legal pad beside it, and I started writing, not chores, but questions. What was actually owed here, and to whom? What 31 years and one folded piece of paper had cost me, and what, exactly, I intended to do about it. I am not, by nature, a dramatic woman. I don't believe in scenes. I believe in facts, laid out cleanly, at a time and place of my choosing. So at 6 the next morning, the exact hour Chelsea's chore list demanded breakfast be ready, I was already up, dressed, and on the phone with Priya. "You still have the paperwork from after your husband passed?" she asked, only half awake herself. "I never stopped having it," I said. She laughed, not unkindly. "You've been sitting on documentation for 19 years, and you're calling me at 6 a.m. because of a chore list?" "I'm calling you," I said, "because I think it's time somebody in this house remembered whose name is actually on the deed." We talked through what I already knew but had simply never needed to use before. The deed in my name alone. The fact that Daniel had never been added to it despite years of assuming. In that soft, unspoken way families assume things, that the house would simply become his one day. We talked through the quarterly bank statements showing the transfers I'd been making to cover their rent, transfers Daniel had never once questioned closely enough to notice where the money actually came from. Priya didn't tell me what to do. She's not that kind of lawyer, and I'm not that kind of person, but she did say one thing that stuck with me the rest of that morning. "You've spent 19 years being generous quietly," she said. "There's nothing wrong with being clear loudly, just once." I printed 3 things before anyone else in the house woke up. A copy of the deed, a summary of the transfers I'd been making, and a simple 1-page letter I wrote myself, the kind of document that doesn't need a lawyer's letterhead to land, only the truth. By the time Chelsea came downstairs at 7, hair still damp, already glancing toward the stove to see whether breakfast had materialized on schedule, I was sitting at the kitchen table with coffee. 3 pieces of paper stacked neatly in front of me, and Daniel, summoned by a text that simply said kitchen, now, please, trailing in behind her, looking like a man walking into a meeting he suspected, correctly, he was not going to enjoy. "Morning," I said, pleasant as ever. "Before we get into the chore list, I thought we should clear a few things up." Chelsea's eyes flicked to the papers on the table. I watched something shift behind her expression, not fear yet, more like recalculation. I started with the deed. I slid it across the table the same way she'd slid her chore list across it 12 hours earlier, and I let that mirror sit there for a second before I said anything at all. "This house," I said, "is in my name. Only my name. It has been since your father-in-law passed, Daniel, and it will stay that way unless I decide otherwise. Not because I don't love you. Because I'm not willing to be assumed out of my own front door." Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Then I slid over the second sheet, the transfer summary, and I watched the color actually leave Chelsea's face as she scanned the dates, the amounts, the destination account she clearly hadn't expected to see traced back to a name she recognized instantly as mine. "For 2 years," I said, "I've been covering the gap on your rent. Quietly. Because I love my son, and because I didn't want either of you carrying a weight I was able to help with. I never mentioned it because I didn't think it needed mentioning. I'm mentioning it now because apparently generosity, in this house, gets read as an invitation to hand me a laundry schedule at midnight." Nobody said a word. Daniel's ears had gone red the way they used to when he was 12 and caught in something. I kept my voice level. Level is important. Level is how you make sure the room remembers your composure instead of your anger. "So here's where we actually stand," I said. "You're welcome to stay while you get back on your feet. Genuinely welcome. This is still your home too, Daniel, in every sense that matters to me. But the rent support ends today, not out of spite. Because if we're going to live under one roof again, we're going to do it as adults who see each other clearly, not as a landlord and a service provider you happen to also call mom." Chelsea found her voice first, thinner than the one she'd used the night before. "We didn't mean it like. I know exactly how you meant it," I said, and for the only time all morning, I let something sharper slip through. "You meant it exactly the way it read." That was the moment I'd carry with me the longest, Not the papers, not even the number on that bank statement. It was watching a woman who'd spent 2 years narrating me as somebody's harmless, slightly outdated mother-in-law finally understand, all at once, that the woman she'd been narrating had simply chosen, for a very long time, not to correct her. Daniel finally spoke. Mom, I didn't know about the rent thing. I swear I didn't know it was you. I believe you, I said, and I did. That was almost the saddest part, that he'd taken money for 2 years without once being curious enough to ask where it came from. Some kinds of comfort, I've learned, are only possible when you've decided not to look too closely at where they're coming from. The chore list was still sitting on the counter where Chelsea had left it. I picked it up, folded it once, and set it gently in front of her. You're welcome to keep this, I said, as a souvenir. But it's not going on my refrigerator. The next several weeks were quieter than I expected, and stranger. Chelsea barely spoke to me directly for the first few days, moving through the house like she'd wandered into someone else's story by mistake. Which, in a way, she had. Daniel tried, clumsily, to bridge things, offering to cook dinner one night in a gesture so uncharacteristic I nearly laughed. I let him. I didn't need the apology performed loudly. I needed it lived, quietly, over time, the same way I'd absorbed everything else for years. They found their own place within 2 months, faster than I think either of them expected, once the rent support genuinely stopped and the math of their own lives became something they had to solve themselves instead of assuming I'd solve it for them. I helped them move out. I even cried a little in the driveway, because he's still my son, and love doesn't evaporate just because you've finally drawn a line inside it. I still see them. Sunday dinners, most weeks, at my table, on my terms, cooked because I want to cook, not because a piece of paper on my counter told me a deadline. Chelsea is different with me now, not warm, exactly, but careful, in the particular way people are careful once they've learned a thing about you they didn't expect to learn. A few months after they moved out, Daniel came by alone one evening, sat at the same kitchen table where I'd laid out those 3 sheets of paper, and asked me, quietly, why I'd never told him about the house being solely mine, about the money. Because I never thought I'd need to, I said. I assumed being your mother was proof enough of who I was in this family. I was wrong. Sometimes you have to hand people the paperwork before they'll believe what was true the whole time. He didn't have much to say to that. Neither did I, really. Some ledgers don't need more entries. They just need to finally be read out loud. If there's one thing I'd want anyone watching this to take with them, it's this. Quiet generosity is not the same thing as invisibility, and the moment someone hands you a list of demands in your own house, that's not the moment to shrink. That's the moment to remind them, calmly, exactly whose name is on the deed. If any of this sounds familiar, if you've ever been the one quietly holding a family together while everyone else decided you were the help, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Sometimes just saying it out loud is the first line in a ledger finally being balanced.